Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books and stuff. And this is a discussion that I tried to have twice already, and then each time I stopped recording because I didn't feel that I was actually making sense. So this is the third approach to this topic, and I want to talk about realism in fantasy and why I think it may have become something of a problem. But first of all, those of you who are new here, because I gained some new subscribers, especially the Grimdark video kind of blew up, sort of, almost, I guess. If you're new, thank you very much for showing up. I hope you enjoyed here. Please subscribe, like, share, talk to me. I appreciate all of that. If you're one of the old people that have been here all the while, I still love you a lot because, you know, I wouldn't have been here without you this far in. So yeah. I guess it's time to talk about a book or more books. And I want to cheer another one of my Patreon backers, and this time it goes out to Joe or Joseph. Thanks, man. I really appreciate you. And one time I will actually start reading your books, I promise. And this one's for you. Cheers. Yeah, if you want to be personally cheered, the Patreon's there for you. You can even decide which beer I should use to toast you. It's a possibility. Well, there's no obligations for anyone to actually show up. I mean, I would love to have more Patreon backers, but that's all up to you. Anyway, let's look at what I actually want to do today. And that is, I want to talk about realism in fantasy and where it may have come from and how it has come to the point where this is realistic. It has become, or realism has become, a thing to be praised in itself. Realism in itself has become a thing to be praised in fantasy, which sounds weird, doesn't it? And why that has some dangerous side effects and why we should maybe look at what to do about it. That's sort of the plan for today. So I will start by claiming that in recent history, realism in fantasy literature has become something that we look for. A lot of us look for. A lot of people praise a book for being realistic, having a realistic view of the world, a realistic view of characters, having realistic characters, and so forth. It kind of dovetails with the whole grimdark debate, I guess. And I want to look at like how we actually got there and what kind of side effects this has. So that's sort of the rough plan for today. Let's start at, the olden days and look at how realistic or not realistic those were. And we'll go back to my usual suspects, that those being Robert E. Howard and J.R.R. Tolkien, because they're like good examples for two different approaches to writing fantastic literature in the 30s and 40s. Well, Howard died in 36, but still. And those are, compared to what you might call realistic today, very, very different in approach. One of them writes adventure stories, action adventure stories that are full of, like, unrealistic things and characters that are very much existentialist, Ubermensch, Conan, or in all kinds of ways larger than life and have very little psychological, nuance or anything like that. That's how Robert E. Howard writes characters, and it works very well for the kind of stories that he's telling. A different approach can be said with J.R.R. Tolkien, whose model he models his stories after is mythology. And what can you say? His characters are not very realistic in that regard, but they don't have to be because, characters in mythology are also not very realistic characters. Beowulf is not a realistic character with all kinds of flaws. I mean, yeah, he does have some flaws, and don't get me wrong, some flaws apply also in Lord of the Rings, right? But he has some flaws. He has, and even other characters in mythology, in Greek mythology, have flaws. It's how the whole tragedy works out, right? You have pride, and you have hubris, and then you have the fall after hubris. So they are not perfect, but they are also very much exemplifications or very abstract personifications of principles in a lot of ways, and not what you might call a contemporary, like look at like a realistic character. Once again, psychology is not a lens that J.R.R. Tolkien uses when he writes stories. It's just not something that he's interested in. Now, there's also like another aspect to it that I think is important to be aware of, and that is psychology. And we'll go back to the world realism as well in a bit. Psychology is not exactly a very dominant discipline in academia in the 1930s and 40s. It is still very much in development. Like when you look at the big sciences or like big disciplines of academia, psychology is fairly new. It starts in like the mid-19th century with mostly Austrian phenomenologists, which are, philosophers. It's a sub-discipline of philosophy in the 19th century. Your Clemens Brentano and guys like that. That's sort of where it starts. And then we go on to, it becoming more medically oriented in a lot of ways. And becomes more powerful with people like Sigmund Freud and Jung and some others around that time. And that is exactly the 30s and 40s and 50s. And when you look at that, you can see how those ideas, psychology as a lens, has made its way into what you might call literature in a lot of ways, right? You look at something like Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, right? He looks at Jungian archetypes in a lot of ways. So we can see how these new information slowly seep into the fantastical. And then you come to writers like Michael Moorcock and his Elric story, which looks already slightly at psychology or like the mind of and the character. And Elric has some nuance to his character that is certainly a step up from what you have seen in like most of the 30s characters, I guess. And then you come to like in the 60s and 70s when like psychology and its weirder side effects have become, something to talk about during, also the more like counterculture movements in the 60s and 70s. And you come to someone like, say, Roger Zelazny and his Amber stories, where that explicitly mention Sigmund Freud and go into all kinds of terms of psychology, and psychology has become a lens through which to write fantasy in that book. Or later with, say, Fritz Leiber and his Our Lady of Darkness, that also goes back to like Jungian psychology, which is very much something that fantasy writers are heavily in love with. Whether it makes sense or not is beside the point here. So we come to that strain where psychology and thus more psychology as a lens through which to look at characters has become a tool that writers in the fantastic use. Obviously, in literary fiction, they do it as well, at least as long, more, like longer, really. And it always takes a while for this to kind of trickle down into our little small island of fantasy and science fiction. Really. So the more nuanced character, or like the idea of looking at motivations, looking at flaws in a character, looking at effects that events have on the psyche of a character, is something that is sort of established within the field in the 60s and 70s. And from there on out, we certainly, you obviously have writers that are better at it and some that are really bad at it, but it has become something that we see. Our writing has thus become more faceted in that regard. And at the same time, we see something similar in a lot of ways in other fields, right? In cinema, we become more aware of that. And we also reach another thing, and that is the world building and other forms of realism. Don't worry, it'll all sort of make sense at the end, I hope. Let's look at like another aspect, and that is realism in depiction, right? You look at movies of the 50s and 60s, a lot of that stuff feels fairly stilted the way it is written, dialogue is written, people are acting, because we're still, basically taking theater plays and performing them in front of a camera. And we're slowly moving away from that, making it feel more and more immersive in a way, using the new technology that we have there, and using that new technology of film to do things that the theater couldn't do. And That is, go away from a like leave behind a very abstract view of the like performance, which theater is fairly abstract when it comes to a lot of things, and turning it into more and more of a fairly, and I have to use the word here, realistic depiction of the world in a lot of ways. This gets, better and better, right? Right, black and white is more abstract as a medium compared to full color, and colors become better, the resolutions become better of cameras, and things look more and more like they actually look to us out here when we go out. And we can argue that this, in a way, helps with immersion of the media consumer. And there's nothing wrong with that in all kinds of ways. Now let's look at a next part that we come to, and that is the gaming influence, right? So we start out with tabletop role-playing games in the 70s and move into the 80s when they have a huge influence on the fantasy literature genre in a lot of ways, and we'll see where that is going in a bit. I'm also going to look at computer games here for a moment, because once again, computer games start out fairly abstract. If you ever played Pong or looked at Pong, you know that's not exactly, a HD experience, immersive augmented reality or virtual reality kind of game for playing table tennis, but you know what I mean. And you looked at like early adventure games like Zork and other stuff like that. They are text-based adventures. They're not high graphics because we have a hardware limitation there. A lot, one that remains for a long time. We're getting so much better with this these days, but it's still like a long way away. So immersion is always hindered by the level of abstraction that is forced upon us, or forced upon the developers of computer games by the limitations of hardware. Graphics become more and more complex and more realistic in a way, photorealistic in a lot of ways over time when, hardware gets better and we can actually do that kind of stuff. And that's when we switch, for example, from like ideas of like having like a top-down view of like all kinds of role-playing games into more like a first-person view and stuff like that. It gets more and more photorealistic because that helps with immersion on the computer. And as I said, I'm going for something specific here. And now I want to look at the tabletop games industry for a while. And that is, you look at the first Dungeons & Dragons editions, the old Dungeons & Dragons edition, they're fairly abstract and fairly simple. You have your 6 stats, you don't have skills or anything, it's very simple. You can write your character down on like an index card, basically. And you go and check out some of the OSR retro clone games, Swords and Wizardry and stuff like that. You can still do that with those kind of games. But, once again, complexity and thus supposed realism comes in, because what games at their heart are a simulation of the world that we can use to try out all kinds of things. That's why games are so interesting for us. They're always a learning experience in a lot of ways. We learn how to interact within like a safe space. Bad word, I know. Within a safe space, within certain constrictions, we learn how to play out and try out specific things. That's how games work. And tabletop RPGs do the same thing, and we think that the closer our simulation of the world in that game, the closer it becomes to our world and our experience, the more immersive it can get in a way. And with tabletop RPGs, you obviously hit that problem that the closer your simulation of the world gets, the more rules you need, the bigger the books get, the more complicated the rules get, because life and the world out there is a fairly complicated place. And I know this because I have played a long time, still one of my favorite games in a lot of ways, the Rolemaster rule system, which by Iron Crown Enterprise, which is a fantastic role-playing game if you want to have a fairly convoluted simulation of the world. If you want that, it does wonders. And it turned out, it began as an addition to Dungeons & Dragons, where you had more complicated combat rules, because someone figured out, like, yeah, you know what? It should make a difference whether I'm using a sword or an axe or a hammer or whatever, and it should also make a difference whether I'm wearing, leather armor or chainmail or plate armor, because different weapons behave differently on different types of armor. We kind of know that if, we are doing actual fencing and stuff like that, so why aren't our rules reflecting that? And that's something that you can witness in the gaming industry in like the 80s especially, is that creep of rules where rules become more and more complicated to simulate more and more aspects of reality. It's no longer improv theater with just like a combat resolution mechanism so we can actually figure out how battles work. And we get more and more rules that describe every single bit and piece of the game. And the obviously, the obvious counter movement later on comes when we have like the idea of story games, where we deliberately focus on the story and no longer so much on the simulation of the world. But what I want to look at here is the fact that at some point a more complicated, a more realistic, or more realistic simulation becomes a quality in itself, something to praise and look forward to. It's something that is good, is considered good in itself. And that is something that we have seen, that we see again and again, and this is the thing that I want to look at, or not look at, like that I want to point towards when I talk about books. Because it doesn't really work as well with books. It works sort of with computer games because we're still on this technical trajectory and we have all these technical constraints that we're sort of overcoming after a while, getting better and better and better. And thus, yes, a computer game that looks better is in some way a more immersive to playing, can be seen as better than one like a previous edition with not as good graphics in a lot of ways. That didn't feel as realistic. In a way, that's something you can do. You can argue that Skyrim is better than Oblivion, is better than Morrowind, is better than, Arena and Daggerfall, because the graphics improved. You can obviously also argue about other things, but that's sort of where we need to go with the literature thing. Because I feel that with books, we kind of fell into the same trap. So what do I mean? Books, in a way, are also about simulating or describing the world, right? We're looking at, an author looks at specifics, has a story to tell, and because we have a limited time to write this story in, and a limited page count, even in the years of, with electronic books, we don't have like an actual limitation on page count. It's literally just the time we have to write. So we have limited time and space to actually do that. So we can't actually go and write a full one-to-one description of the world in our story, because we'll never get done, because, granularity can be amped up to like absolute infinity. So what we do as writers, well, I'm not a writer, but what we do as writers or as dungeon masters, I can sort of go to that one, is we pick and choose the things we want to include because they are in some way or other important to the experience that we want to create. We include descriptions of buildings when they matter. When we include descriptions of clothing when we feel they provide something meaningful, something important to the story. And that's fine and dandy. That's how it's always been done. You put in the things that matter for your story. And the rest is left to the reader to imagine. Now, here's where we come to the problem that I seem to have seen with a lot of fantasy. You look at like a lot of fantasy books, and especially fantasy books of the last couple of decades, you can see that their page count is continuously rising, and you get more and more descriptions of like visuals and stuff like that. Whether it's Wheel of Time and its endless descriptions of clothing that never go anywhere because they're extremely repetitive, but you have something like that. You have like very minute detailed descriptions of stuff in, say, Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn when he describes his magic system, certainly, but other parts as well. It's like we have a more and more detailed description of the world, and that is oftentimes thought of as a good thing, and as an idea that it may be more realistic. Because, we want to know how people dress, we want to know how people look and so forth. And we spend more and more time with world building and descriptions of the world. And put stuff in there that is not necessarily, really tied to the story that we're telling, or doesn't really have any impact on the characters that we're describing. It's just in there because we feel we need to provide a lavishly detailed world description with all kinds of details. And I think that's the first problem. I'll let you know why, because I think it becomes meaningless and it can actually detract from the actual story if I spend like 20 pages reading about like architecture and clothes description of a town, and then our group of heroes just walks into a bar, gets drunk, has a bar fight, and leaves again because they have found the information they need. And I cannot really focus. I just in like sheer numbers. The time it takes for me to read the bar fight and whatever, which may be character forming moments there, the sheer number of pages is so much less than the description of the world that did not go anywhere, that it just really, disadvantages, I guess, the actual story, the actual characters in that regard. And I think that is a first problem. Let me show you like an example that I think explains what I mean. And for that, I'll go back to good old J.R.R. Tolkien. Because Tolkien does the same. Tolkien has parts in his books, in Lord of the Rings, that are extremely detailed, in like very fine-grained detail. And you know which ones those are? They're the nature descriptions. Tolkien writing about forests. I still haven't looked up all the tree names he drops, because they're just trees for me, because I don't care, literally. But and there's a reason for that, because J.R.R. Tolkien is very much interested in nature and the way, civilization or modernity is destroying nature. He's very much on that eco train all the way before it became like an actual movement in a lot of ways, because he's a conservative, and, caring for the nature was like a really conservative thing before we discovered neoliberalism and all these other things. I don't know. So Tolkien describing nature in detail, whether it is all the way at the beginning when they're hiking through the Shire, whether it's Merry and Pippin in Fangorn Forest, whether it's Sam and Frodo when they meet Faramir on the other side there, it's always Ithilien, that's the name of the place there. Whether it's the nature in Ithilien, he cares about that, and it's an important message or part of his story. On the contrary, we don't get like a lot of descriptions of towns. Yes, we know sort of how Minas Tirith looks, but like we don't get like a large description of architecture of Minas Tirith. We just like get like one basic picture painted, and that's it. Because he doesn't really care about that kind of stuff. And that's fine, because once again, Lord of the Rings is very much also about the loss of nature in a lot of ways. So it makes sense there. All right, so let's look at why this becomes something of a problem in a lot of ways. First of all, I already mentioned, if we spend too much time on realistic or like pseudo-realistic depictions or lavish, detailed depictions or descriptions of visuals in our book, we kind of devalue the actual story, because, it is still a numbers game. Depending how many lines and words I use on one compared to the other, my brain will weigh one more than the other. The next thing, I think, is something that is really important to me, and I think is a big shame. And that is, we're taken away from the act of reading. Because reading is about imagination. Reading is very much about imagination. And that one is coded a lot of times into our personality. My experience, my imagination are tied to how I imagine the world. That's my personal background in a lot of ways. And the less detailed a description of, say, a building is, the more I will imagine it the way that I would imagine buildings in that area. It's why we get all these arguments when, a TV adaptation of a fantasy series comes up, and everyone's like, I did not imagine the Shire to look like this. I didn't think the Two Rivers should look like that. You have all these arguments because they all look different in our brains. And that's good. That is really good. It makes literature more accessible, because I can basically import my cultural background into that imagination. in my personal imagination, a lot of like medieval houses in medieval Europe towns look like those typical Bavarian style architecture with the black beams and the white plaster in between, because that's what I grew up with, because it's like how houses look around here in Germany, old houses. But for someone in Greece, I assume they will look very different. For someone in India, I assume when they think about houses, they will also look very different again. And by having too detailed descriptions of everything in our books, we're taking away that chance, that accessibility to, or that openness to all kinds of cultural backgrounds. We're hampering, we're crippling the imagination of the reader, and that's a shame in itself. We can probably talk more about that, but it's just like one aspect. So we have, first of all, we have the aspect that through lavish, overly detailed descriptions of the world, the actual plot and the characters get pushed into the background. Then we have the crippling of the imagination by giving, the reader too little room to, actually exercise their imagination and fantasy. And now we come to the third one that I think may be the most harmful one, and that is when realism becomes an argument to justify all kinds of things. The Game of Thrones argument, if you will. And what do I mean by that? When you look at Game of Thrones, and I'll just pick A Song of Ice and Fire here because I think it's a very good example to show what I want to show. It goes for a lot of other books as well. Don't worry. And that is one of the common criticisms, or like often voiced criticism of A Song of Ice and Fire, is the large, the violence, the misogynist violence, the sexist violence, the violence against women, sexual violence and other violence against women in these books. And it's there. It's very hard to deny that it is there. And oftentimes people trying to defend George R. R. Martin on that count go like, you know what? But it's realistic. It's a realistic depiction of medieval Europe and the societies in medieval Europe, which were fairly sexist, and there was a lot of violence against women. And then you can sit down and have an argument whether that is correct. You talk to medievalists, you can look at like sources of the time, you can find out that, yeah, there was also a lot of sexual violence against men, but for some reason George R. R. Martin doesn't show a lot of men getting raped. He doesn't like that, I assume. And so forth. And you can get into the weeds really deep there. And I would argue that's wrong, because you're already fallen into the realism trap there, and you don't have to. No. The problem is not that it's realistic or not so realistic. The problem is that George R. R. Martin chose this specific part of what he thinks a realistic depiction of medieval Europe is to put it into his book. And when we circle back to what I said about J.R.R. Tolkien, that's exactly where we have a problem. The point is, all the things an author chooses to show in his book should contribute in some way or other to the atmosphere, to the story, and have a point in it. So what we need to look at is like when George R. R. Martin goes and shows a lot of sexual violence against women, is that in some part, going to influence the story? Does that have meaning within the story? Does it impact a lot of his female characters? Is a lot of their character development centered around the abuse and the violence they suffer? And if yes, then you can talk about why that is actually a good idea that he includes that, because he's trying to make a point on sexual violence and its impact on society. If not, it's just window dressing. And then you can argue whether it is, gratuitous and all these other things, and ask about like why is it still there? And that's the question you should ask there. As comparison, we have a lot of sexual violence in Richard K. Morgan's Land Fit for Heroes. And there it is clearly an important part of the story, because we're talking about Ringil Eskiath and his character, his like trauma through being sexually abused, and how that influences with his homosexuality. It goes in all kinds of important ways. But the depiction of graphic violence against and homophobia and sexual violence plays an important part in the story that Richard K. Morgan is telling there, that his character goes through. Whereas in, say, Game of Thrones, I would argue that the sexual violence that we find there is not exactly the main point of the story that George R. R. Martin is telling. It is mostly window dressing in the background to give us an image of these are bad times. And at that point, its realistic argument doesn't count. The question is not, is it realistic? The question is like, why is it in there? And that one we can very much like look at and say, you know what, maybe George R. R. Martin just wanted to have images of women being tortured in the background because it would sound like a, oh, the world is so dark image for a lot of mostly male readers. and that's a question we should actually ask in these cases. So we've come almost to the end. Let me reiterate and sum up. All right. In a lot of art forms and media forms, realism has been an important part because it helps with immersion. Those are mostly art forms or media forms that have technical constraints, like movies, cinema, computer games, tabletop role-playing games, I guess, in a lot of ways. And that has led to us appreciating realism, or what you might call realism, visual realism most of the time, as a good quality, as something to be praised in itself. And from all these other medias as influence, it has made its way into fantasy literature, into literature in general, but also into fantasy literature. And there, it has some unforeseen or unfortunate consequences because it actually hampers a lot of the things that literature is already doing on itself. Up to a point, the only way where it doesn't work is definitely psychological realism, because that's something that actually literature can do just as well as anyone else. But with all the visual realism, we're reading books. They are a different media form. We don't have technical constraints there. The only constraint when it comes to visual realism or like visual depictions in any form is the imagination of the reader and the writer. So looking at photorealistic depictions of the world is unnecessary. It relegates the actual story and characters to like a backdrop, to a background. It hampers and constrains the imagination and fantasy of the reader. And in the worst cases, it can be used to justify things that don't need justification, because we think realism good, and something can be put as like it's realistic and then it's also good and we don't need to talk about it anymore. And that can lead to justifying, for example, a lot of like sexist and misogynist depictions in fantasy books like Game of Thrones. And that's a problem. So what should we do about it? Well, maybe when we look at stuff and want to say, wow, this is so realistic, maybe we should just sit back and think, but does it have to be realistic in this case? Does it actually do something for the story? Is the realism there just to distract me from the actual story? Is the realism there just to impress me with how cruelly a writer can describe sexual violence or other violence? Or does it actually serve a purpose? If it serves a purpose, realism's fine. If it serves no other purpose than to be realistic, we could maybe drop it and focus on other things in books, because that's the strength of books. They don't need a budget. Like, they don't need a special effects budget at all. Alright, that's my point about like why realism in fantasy is something of a problem. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have reasons, arguments, all kinds of things, let me know in the comments and kind of have us a discussion about it. And yeah, have a great day. Cheers.